Welcome to this week's episode of the Visual Studio Remote Office Hours. I'm your host, Matt Christensen, and the person that you just heard in the background there is today's guest. And we're going to talk about moving from being a developer or engineer, software engineer, into the role of being a program manager. And I'm sure a lot of people have either taken that journey or considered it or just thought about like, why would you ever do this? Coding is the most fun in the world. Why would you give that up for something as boring as program management? And that's what we're going to talk about today. And today's guest is none other than Mr. Brady Gaster. Hello, Brady. How are you doing?
Doing good. How's it going?
Very well, thank you. It's as you may or may not know out there, the state of Washington, where both myself and Brady are located. We have a lot of smoke, so we can't even go outside here in the, there you go. I don't know if you can see it a little bit. The sun is hard to see, and so we're grounded. Brady, how are you, my friend? Can you tell people a little bit about your background as an engineer and how you made the move into Microsoft?
I can absolutely do that. Thanks a lot for having me on the show today. I see you already have some folks in the comments, so that's good stuff. A little bit about me. Like Matt said, I spent the majority of my career prior to Microsoft as a programmer. For the most part, I was a consultant. Bounced around and did a bunch of consulting gigs, all of it in .NET after ASP and COM. And then I came to Microsoft as an evangelist. And thanks to my good buddy Mads referring me, I became a PM. And since then, I've done less programming, I've done more PMing, and it's been interesting. So we'll talk about that today.
Yep. So the reason why I thought Brady was going to be a really interesting person to talk about this, because you're not alone, Brady. Other people have gone from being programmers and then coming into Microsoft and become a PM. But your story is a little bit more interesting, I think, because you kind of took a detour. You were doing some documentation, you were doing some evangelism, where you still did sort of a mix of coding and PM work and all this sort of stuff. But we're going to get to that.
Mm-hmm.
So you're mentioning you did a lot of .NET. Were you like a full-time, 8 hours a day or 10 hours a day, whatever, in Visual Studio type of developer?
Yes. Absolutely. 10 hours, 8 hours would have been a joke. That was like before I had my coffee in the morning. Yeah. Yes, I was the webmaster for the Virginia Department of Transportation for a little while, which meant that I not only did a whole lot of front page development, showing my age here. Great product. Kind of miss it some days. Don't know if I miss the extensions, but I do miss front page. But I did a lot of stuff there. That's kind of when I moved in actually teaching. And Mads and I've been around the world together and given presentations. And that's kind of where that came from, was really teaching folks there how to become good web programmers or kind of get started with web programming, because it was kind of new at the time. Then we moved into Visual InterDev, and I used that for a number of years. I know at least one person that still has a box on their desk. Some of our devs back at the office too. And after that, it was Visual Studio, and pretty much Visual Studio up until, I guess one of the changes that you mentioned in my career was when I went to Docs. When I went to Docs, I started using a Mac. And one of the reasons for that was I was kind of learning some of the other non.NET frameworks and kind of just getting a better understanding as to what all was out there. So that meant VS Code. So I discovered VS Code, started writing some VS Code extensions for Azure, and just kind of looked around and tried different stuff out. Now I'm working in .NET again, actually on the .NET team on the Signal RPM. And then I'm also responsible for some of the end-to-end experiences that we have for .NET developers on Azure. So if you are doing .NET on Azure or using microservices and you have ideas on how to make it better, please reach out, because we'd love to hear your feedback. But yes, it's kind of interesting being on a Mac talking to you now, being RDP'd to a PC on my network where I'm doing my Visual Studio development and testing stuff out. But Azure's big. It's not just this product or that product or this service or that service. There's a myriad of different things that you could try out. So one of my jobs is to literally just break stuff, just keep trying stuff out and get feedback back to those teams. So that's kind of what I've been doing. I don't want to say I'm QA, but it does feel QA-ish sometimes.
Yeah.
So.
That sounds kind of fun. Your job is to try to break things.
Yep.
Okay, so at some point, you're doing your development in Visual Studio, full-time job, and you get a job at Microsoft. And your first job at Microsoft, what is that?
My first job at Microsoft was I was an evangelist. So I was a developer platform evangelist, and I worked in the corporate Azure team. So what that meant was I paired up with Mads and the ASP.NET team because App Service can run a lot of different tech. So I was kind of the .NET person on the team, and John Galloway was on the team, and he became the .NET person, and I kind of became the App Service evangelist, if you will. So we just flew around the world, talked to customers, figured out what people liked about it. We would give feedback from customers to the product groups, and they would, sometimes make suggestions that we go talk to the customer and get more information. Sometimes they would just make changes. Now we have a team of folks who do that kind of work called the Cloud Advocates. Shane Boyer is one of them. Sandquist drives that team. A lot of really, really great presenters on the team as well. I work closely with Shane because he's kind of our .NET person. So he tells me what customers are telling him when he talks to them in the field, as well as other folks who are in the field, like our consultants and whatnot, who I worked with when I was in evangelism. I get all that feedback, and then we start talking to customers. I schedule interviews with customers, usually spend about 2 days a week. And we literally just have a list of things we want to watch customers try. And we watch them try it. We figure out kind of like what their pain points are. And then we go back to those product teams and we say, this is what we saw customers do. Do you think customers would go and click this button? And they were like, why would customers click that button? Well, it's got 4 arrows pointing at it. So maybe that's why. So, then we start looking at those signals and figuring out, are we sending customers the wrong signals? Are we guiding them down the wrong rabbit hole? And that kind of thing. So transitioning from being a dev and thinking about the idea of, when I started PMing, I would say, let's just put a checkbox on the form. Well, there's all these reasons why we don't want to put a checkbox there. There's all these reasons why we don't want the validation to be a checkbox. There's all these different, reasons why we do things the way we do things. And a lot of becoming a PM is learning that process and learning that there are, 30 years of developers who've worked inside of Visual Studio. So just putting a checkbox on a form is not as simple as just dragging a checkbox from the toolbox and putting it on the form and calling it good. There's a lot of other things that go into that. How does that impact the project template? How does that impact the vision of the Visual Studio product? How does that impact the vision the product group who built that template expects people to use the template, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. A good example, we have a template change coming up, and I'm going to talk about this tomorrow with John Galloway on the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up Show. We have a change coming in the Web API templates and ASP.NET Core 5, where we're enabling Open API or Swagger by default. So we talked about how you want to surface that experience to the customer. We wanted it to be on by default, which means a checkbox. However, when we're talking about the command line switch, we want it to be negative, such as no HTTPS. That's something somebody would explicitly want to opt into. I don't want HTTPS. We wanted that to be explicit on Open API as well. So one of the builds that I got of Visual Studio, it had the new template, but when I checked the box, it would turn it off because it was a double negative, and whatever build I got, that was just a bug in the code. So you think about making a video for that you got to show tomorrow when you've got that build and you know what's going to be fixed the next day. You got to do some dances. That's a 2-hour video that you got to make that probably would take you 10 minutes to actually record. So when you think about what a dev does versus what a PM does, a lot of it is, devs talk about the different components or the different projects. PMs talk about those different components too. It's just a lot of times those components are entire organizations. They might have 200 people, or they're teams that might have 4 different requirements that you need to help them with so that they can help you with the different 8. So, these are all dependencies, just like programming.
Mm. Okay, yeah. So it seems like also like from the PM's perspective, there's a lot of work that happens before that feature that needs to be implemented even reaches the engineering organization, right? Like there's all this footwork, but there's also a lot of preparation that engineering does before they start writing any code. So where do we make that split? Like what is the preparation? What is the role of the preparation for, let's say, engineering versus PM?
The role of preparation for engineering versus PM. Oh man, I think it's a little more similar than we would think. So when I was a programmer, I was kind of a TDD or BDD enthusiast. So I would, try to write tests to prove everything. Instead of having to just sit there and make a bullet list of work that I would never get finished, because no programmer can get finished with a bullet list of work without coming up with 15 other bullet lists of work. So I would write unit tests to kind of box myself in. So the unit tests are basically me having a list of things that I need to do. If you're a PM, that unit test is kind of those customer pieces of feedback. We did this experiment where we, like the Open API thing, I'll go back to that because it's fresh on my mind. We gave this experiment to folks and we said, try to make Swagger emit from your web API project. We don't care which package you use. Which package do you want me to use? So we try Swashbuckle or try NSwag, and then it was set the homepage. People would go into like their MVC routes and start coding up the route to the homepage and changing it there instead of right-clicking the project properties. All of these are things we never thought we would see people do. So these are all surprises, that when you write your unit test, you could write 50 unit tests for one little, unit of work. The first user that comes along, he's going to introduce any unit test you should have thought of. So I think that we kind of have the same problem when it comes to PMing, is when you watch the customers use it, you're like, wow, I didn't think of that one. That's just a new way to box somebody in. So
yeah, with that, there's also different types of program managers out there, right? So there are the product owners. Like if we talk about in the Scrum sense, there's the product owners versus the Scrum master. And then there's the old school, maybe project manager that sits there with the Gantt charts and makes sure every little piece of work is done at the exact time that they were scheduled to be done and all that stuff. And we are neither and all, I believe. It's my conclusion so far. And some people are finding themselves naturally more in project management over product ownership or product design. And some are, so that it's like there's a scale. And you can either be on the project management scale or the technical feature development scale. And so this is my own theory.
That's a great theory.
And I think if you come from being a developer, you're probably closer over here to the technical PM more than maybe your project management. Do you think that's true?
I think that would be a legitimate assumption. Like there are, I won't name any names, but there are PMs with whom we both work who are highly I'll pick on you. You're perfect. Who are not only highly technical, but they're also customers. You know what I mean? Mads and I both work in Visual Studio and have for years and years and years. So when Mads comes along and he says, we need an extension to do XYZ, he's probably speaking from the perspective of somebody who needs that extension. However, talking to somebody who is, say, having a particular issue with a Java application or a Java IDE, as a Signal RPM, it's important to me because like we have a Java client for Signal R. So when you get into studying that, that's an entirely different gestalt of user. So at that point, I would usually go into a meeting and I would bring along a Java programmer or a Java PM, because there's kind of a process with each programming language. I would say that you and I are deeply technical when it comes to our area, and we kind of know not only the technical aspects of it, and we can like code up a prototype to give to a dev and show them what we want it to do, and then let them write the real code, if you will. But with a Java app, I wouldn't be able to do that. You know what I mean? So I would have to rely on my programmer at that point. Like you're saying, I think there are a couple different types of PMs. There's definitely a technical PM who can really dive in and write the code the way you do. Then there's prototypical PMs who are folks like me who come along and they can write the code, but they can write the code the way a customer would or the way a consultant would, and they can break it the way a customer would as well. I think there's value to that because then you're putting it through the paces before it hits the customer's hands. So I think if I were to give you a Visual Studio extension, I wouldn't want Mads to test that extension because you're going to cut it with a totally different cloth.
Okay. So we got a question here. What is the role of a software architect when you have a program manager? We should almost get Fowler or Damien to talk about that. But do you have a take on that? I
do. You said Damien, so I'll just rattle on Damien and Michaela. They've actually set up a fantastic series, if you will, and I'll talk about their meeting series and I'll tell you what they do in it. Their meeting series is essentially like the architect's office hours. So what they do is they get all the PMs in a room. Some dev leads come as well. And that's the point where you kind of come to the table and you go, so there's this UI framework I want to build in the following way. These are the things I'm thinking of. What do the architects know in terms of the things that devs are building on the team right now? Because they kind of have a visibility at a very top level. Like they know how all the different teams are architecting all the different stuff because they kind of have to bless it, if you will. And what that does is that gives the architects the ability to kind of look cross-team. So since they're looking cross-team, they know if my team is going to build something in runtime that there's a tooling thing that could complement it well, their job really is to put us together and to make sure that at least we're not going off the ranch, you know what I mean? And that the code that I'm writing could make that code easier to write or, complement the future better. That to me is kind of where our architects have been very, very valuable. They also do a lot of the stuff that I do from the prototypical perspective, but what they're prototyping is like when Ryan Nowak did a bunch of stuff, one of the things that he did was he would figure out exactly how many megabytes of CPU and RAM it took for a .NET application to spin up and run. And then he figured out how many times he could run that inside of a Kubernetes cluster. So whereas we kind of think about those, what the customers are feeling, the architects kind of look across team and they look at like, let's build this best for the customer so that end-to-end experience is also good, technically sound as well.
So, but I think it's fair to say that you can be an architect in the Visual Studio team, whether you used to be an engineer or whether you were a PM, but I think you have to be highly technical. I think that's what you're saying, right? It sounds like a very technical, but it's way beyond just being a really good engineer. There's more to it.
Yeah, no. I would totally agree with that. We get together, and one of the things that, just to give you an example where I'm working again, is we are working on the ACTP REPL, which is a way to do command line testing of web APIs. And in the same breath, we're working on changes to the template. So I get in there and we kind of talk about the changes we want to make to the template. We talk about the changes that we're making to the REPL. Damon says, hey, did you know that we're working on blah, 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 blah over here? And I go, no, that's going to complement this well. And it's like all the pieces get dialed in together. So that tends to help things. Yeah. Ryan would do that a lot too in the .NET space, the ASP.NET space.
Yeah. I hope that answers that question. Here's another one from Andy. We touched a little bit on this. What's the difference between program manager and project manager? Is the PM a more technical role?
It's not a matter of technicality, frankly. So let me take the first part of the question, program manager and project manager. I've been both. Projects have timelines in terms of like when they start and when they end. Programs don't. So Syed was the program manager for the web publishing tools, and you were the program manager for the web tools all up, like the stuff that, building HTML and CSS and all that jazz that you do. At some point in time, Syed's skills were needed on the .NET Core project structure. So he got to work on that, and I became the program manager for web publishing. Does that mean web publishing had an end date? Of course not. And it's a feature that needed a PM. So I stepped in to do that. In Microsoft, we don't do a lot of project management. A lot of times, for example, you talked about my journey around the company. To get to that, after evangelism, I came to engineering. I'll promise there's a loop here. After engineering, I went to documentation, worked in the docs engineering crew for a little while on docs, Microsoft Com. After that, I went to marketing, which is why I know some of this stuff. In marketing, we would actually hire really fantastic project managers who would come in and they would project manage something like the Ignite planning process or the build planning process. And we would hire them back every year, you know what I mean? Because they do a good job at that thing every year. Whereas a program manager, I think my favorite metaphor for it is that you're the CEO of a product. You're the CEO of a feature. So it's not like that feature is going to go away. Like people aren't just going to stop using web publishing because Syed's not the PM of web publishing anymore. It needs a PM. So now it's Angelos. So.
That was great. That was a great explanation. I really like that. Like the CEO of a feature.
Now, to be honest with you, I think I learned, no offense to you, because you were a great teacher. All blessed to you. And Syed as well. But I think I learned a lot of the skills and how to be an efficient PM when I was in marketing, working with project managers who were working on conferences that they had 60 days to plan cradle to grave. If you've ever been to one of our big conferences in person, think about planning one of those for a year.
Yeah, they're working back. They have the date, and then they work back from that, right? And they figured out, I should have started last year. I better get on this.
Yep, that's called a workback schedule. Yeah, that's called a workback schedule, and PMs don't do it as much as project managers do it.
Right.
And it's very valuable. You know what I mean? On the flip side, I would never imagine that I would have a project manager that would have an Excel spreadsheet contrasting features of different tools. For instance, the stuff that you used to do in the web tooling, you had a spreadsheet that had every feature, every competitor's feature, everything you knew about the entire ecosystem. I've seen the PM who worked on the debugging, the Visual Studio debugger. He's worked on that feature for 12 years or something. His spreadsheet, just infinity. You know what I mean? Feature after feature after feature after feature. If, God forbid, anything happened to that PM, or you lose interest in that product or something else changed, somebody could come along and look at that spreadsheet and go, got it. This is the history of this product and the history of the competitors in the product space. I know everything I need to know. That is a program manager. That's what a program manager does.
Yeah. And I think also, just to add to that, I think there's a component that is that the program manager is the ambassador of the users, the customers, whereas a project manager may or may not ever see a customer, right? That's not necessary to deliver on a specific date.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for us in the Visual Studio team, or the .NET team, in what's called DevDiff, the developer division in Microsoft, we've had a pivot like some years ago that really puts PMs in front of the customers. And I remember, and Brady, I'm interested in if you had the same experience. When I was a full-time developer before I joined Microsoft, I wasn't necessarily that interested in talking to the users. I was more interested in solving technical problems the best possible way. Like, I was, just to get back to the architecture, like that was highly interesting to me, and writing the most beautiful code that I could. And so that was a big change in becoming a PM after that. But is that your same experience? Like, as an engineer, you were not as interested in the user?
I think there's a point in your life if you go from if you go from dev to PM or dev to architecture. I think every dev gets to this point. They might not be a dev anymore, but I think every dev has a moment in time where they understand their user on a more personal level. And when they do, they probably aren't going to be as efficient in the future, because that care slows them down. Like, you begin to kind of second guess yourself a little more. Like, is this going to end up creating a good experience later? Is this going to be something I have to, God forbid, maintain more later? I think that's the point where you kind of slow down. For me, I definitely slowed down when we were working on the publishing tools again. I started to kind of rethink some of the stuff we were trying to do in Azure, and to think about how customers would attack the problem. And I think we all go, no, we know. We've done this. I've published 100 sites to Azure. I know better than anybody. So you watch somebody else do it. And that's the point where you go, I don't know half of what I thought I knew. And I think that's a point where you become a more efficient PM. I've seen developers like become PMs when they watched somebody use their feature. It's like something flips and they're like, whoa, I totally care about this in a way that I didn't before. I think as a general rule, and this isn't to be mean, but when I was a developer, I wasn't as patient with my users as I have been since I've been a PM. Now that is my life. Like, I was in a call this morning at 7:15 talking to somebody who wanted to understand how to present something better. To me, that's important. It's a different way of thinking about it, I guess. It was easier because we could just kind of plow headlong into what we thought was right and figure out a way to prove it. But what you end up doing is you spend a lot of time building features that people can't discover, won't get investment, or later on will just fall out because of the fact that they probably shouldn't have been they probably should have been more well thought about in the beginning. They should have been more fleshed out, I guess.
Yeah.
I made a joke at one point. I saw a few of us, I'll take credit for one myself, said, I think a lot of PMs at Microsoft, I don't know about other places, but I think a lot of PMs at Microsoft, the first thing they PM, they spend a couple years addressing some of their bad decisions. You know what I mean? Like I should have listened to Syed say, please don't add this one feature into this bandwidth or, things are going to get nasty. I said, no, we can do it. We didn't do it. So, a lot of it is also a lot of being a PM is saying no. Every developer wants to get it done. A lot of PMs just know they can't get it all done. You know what I mean? And I think good PMs or great PMs find a way to not let devs drive themselves crazy trying to get it done.
Yeah.
So,
that's an interesting one, because do you know this saying? I need to give credit to someone, but I don't know who came up with this, but it goes something like this. Don't let perfect get in the way of good.
Mm-hmm.
So as a PM, when you design a feature, we always strive to design something that's perfect, where all stakeholders are happy. It solves the problem in the cheapest possible way for engineering to implement, and and of course, rarely it goes perfect. Like nothing really ever goes perfect.
Mm-hmm.
But so when perfect is 100%, and all of a sudden you get to these issues and you start peeling away. Okay, we can do 90% perfect. We can do 80, 70%. Like at what point do you drop the feature and say, okay, let's not spend more time here, instead of saying, okay, let's actually 80% is enough.
Mm-hmm.
How does that dance?
That's a tough one, because you've always got passion projects. You know what I mean? But before everybody joined us, Mads and I were talking about how in 2014, I think was the last project I ever put on Codeplex. I built a small demo application that in 2020 we're actually shipping in the box. And this was like a demo to kind of prove a set of features out, and now we're actually putting it in the box. That was a point in time where, like, you and I talked about it in the hallway, and we said, let's build it this way, and we built it this way. And then there was back to those rules that we talked about, and somebody's asking about politics in here. I'll kind of bring them up at the same time. There was a kind of a point in time rule in Visual Studio where if you wanted to do something in the Solution Explorer, it had to impact the solution or the project. So if you were doing something in that window, it needed to impact your project in some way, right? Like reconfigure something, add a NuGet package, something along those lines. And what we were doing in that window, but it was doing something against your Azure subscription instead of against your project. So that feature couldn't make it into the box. Now, do you want to refer to that as politics? Sure. But it's politics because of experiences that we've heard from users where they get confused when we do certain things in different ways. So we stick to it. Now, a couple of years later, things change and Visual Studio becomes a little bit more of a cloud native IDE. There's a lot more stuff there for publishing stuff to Azure, publishing stuff to the cloud, and not only that, but like working in the cloud, like the stuff we're doing in Codespaces. So a lot of that stuff now makes more sense, so that feature lights up now. So a lot of it is just persistence and belief that you're right, and then taking the time to prove it. It's one thing, back to the tests. It's one thing to write tests and prove that your code works, but it's another thing to go and talk to customers and prove that your feature needs to exist or needs to continue to exist. Now, you ask the question, when you get rid of the feature, when you stop shipping updates to it, you will hopefully, when you built the feature, you put telemetry into the feature so that we can actually see whether or not that feature is being used. And if it's being used, when customers use it, are they succeeding or are they failing? And a lot of that is difficult because you have to figure out how to put that telemetry in there so it's very general. Like I did this, I clicked this button didn't work. Here was the error that I got. So a lot of that is being careful on how we handle those types of scenarios. Do we capture too much telemetry? It'll slow the product down. If we capture too little, we won't know what's going wrong. So a lot of it is like when you build these features, you need to also think about building the telemetry into the feature to make sure that people are using it, aren't using it, and if they aren't, if they're being successful. If you have a feature that isn't being used by a lot of people and when they use it, it's failing, you can probably take it out with a lot of pain. If you've got 20,000 people using it every day, that feature's never going anywhere.
And I think that's a really good point, because it's a natural thing that no one does a perfect job at anything, right? Perfect doesn't exist, and so sometimes we're going to implement features that turns out not to work or not to solve the problem it was intended to solve in the best possible way, and people don't use it. And even though it took some time to design and to implement and all this sort of stuff, removing it might be the best solution, right? It's the whole idea of adding positive or negative value. That's something we talk about every now and again, because it's funny when we say, hey, are you adding value? Well, what do you mean? Positive or negative? Right? There's a big difference. And so negative value has to be fixed immediately or removed. Like neutral value, that's a harder one, right? That's where telemetry comes in. Well, do people actually use it? What about the ones who do? Are they like super engaged with it when they do? Does it really solve the problem for them? What alternatives are there, and so on? These are all hard problems to think about. This is all head stuff, right?
It really is. It's really crazy. Scott's asking a good question here. Are you going to put Scott's question up on the screen?
Yeah. All right, question for Brady. What's the least enjoyable part of your job as a PM?
You're not going to like my answer here. You're just not going to like it. And it's going to shock everybody to death. My least favorite part of being a PM over the last year used to be my favorite part of the job as a PM, and that's building content. I know it's really surprising to hear that, but I've worked with a lot of content people like the gent who asked this question, who are so much better than I am at not only creating the content, but at addressing the content that is necessary.
So what is content in this?
Content is docs or creating workshops or creating videos, those kinds of things. And I think that what's happened over the last year is that there've been a shift in towards content like this. And this spontaneous content, the Twitch streams like Jeff's done for years, done a fantastic job at, these types of interviews. This is the type of content that I've found that I gravitate towards more, and that I have a better affinity for. So when I want to sit down and write a workshop out, I just sit there and I go, gosh, I wish I was as good as Scott, or I wish I was as good as Cam, or I wish I was as good as David, and I didn't have the writer's block. I know you get it too. But the other thing is, if I want to work on those things, I'd rather work with people like yourselves who just do such a better job at it. Like docs are in a better state now. Learn's exciting, but I think we have so many great content platforms out there right now. It's like I want to go write content for all of them, but every hour that I'm spending writing that content, I'm 1 hour behind when it comes to dealing directly with a customer or dealing directly with a partner team. And that's kind of what I'm doing now, is like always talking to people and figuring out like, what can we do here to make this better over here? This customer says this customer built an entire API registering on top of this product. Maybe we need to think about building this in this way so that it makes it easier for customers to do that later. Yada, 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 yada. So that is the exciting part for me now. And the content, I feel like I sit there way longer than y'all do, and the content just isn't as good. And then whenever I do write it, you just tell me to write in passive voice all day. So it's like, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing, because as a PM, you're responsible for the feature. You are the CEO of the feature, and that includes the responsibility of your users being able to find out that the feature exists, and that they can read the documentation to know how it's done, that they can find the, let's say, YouTube videos or whatever to get the guidance they need to be successful with the feature.
Exactly.
A lot of work.
It takes a lot of work. And like, and it's not like we shipped .NET 3.1 and then stopped. Like Scott's got to go learn how to use SignalR for .NET 5 and help me with docs on that. The devs are not only, this is another thing you have to think about. What does it mean to be a developer at Microsoft? Well, that means you're also a documenter, because the devs document the features. And then the documenters come along and they give us opportunities to get better. Let's put it that way. It's not like we just throw it over the wall anymore and let Scott worry about it, or let Cam worry about it, or Rick worry about it. We work with them on the docs. I have 30 issues right now in my GitHub folder from the 2 weeks I was on vacation recently that are all docs, and I need to go work on them. But I also have exec reviews to make sure that the features are getting built to make the customers happy, so they'll come read the docs because they're trying the features. So
yeah. So it seems like it's quite the different set of skills that you're using now versus when you were an engineer. But I assume that a lot of the skills you learned as an engineer you can take with you, and that greatly affects your productivity or whatever as a PM. But what would you say was the biggest changes or the hardest thing for you to transition from a
Hey, buddy.
from an engineer to a PM?
Having to take more time. Like devs like to just dive in and start coding it. I don't know how many times I would have a conversation with Mads over lunch, or over beer or whatever, and he would say, you know what we need? I need an extension that I can right click here and it will do blah. And I think I don't know if I was one of the people you talked to about paste as JSON or paste as C# classes before you built it, but I remember being excited about 50 ideas like that. And Mads would immediately go away and just like write it up and ship it and support it to some degree because he had a bunch of extensions out there. He can't support them all. I think that was the thing as a PM that was really the most difficult thing, was to understand that, like, unless you are your industry, kind of the way you were with that, like there's a network of people that kind of support all those techs. So it's a matter of going a little more slowly, going a little more deliberately. The deliberate part is also difficult from the perspective of a dev because every feature sounds great. Like every feature that makes it easier for me to build an app sounds fantastic. Not every one of those features can be sold. Not every one of those features can be maintained. So that was another thing, is that not every feature is worth building. As a dev, everything is worth building. You just build. As a PM, you have to think more like, I got to support that feature. You know what I mean?
Yeah. So was there a particular skill? This is a question. Let's see if I can find her. Any solid advice for new PM hires on how to manage the stress of the job?
Any solid advice? Oh yeah. Manage your schedule. It's yours. Remember that your calendar is your calendar. Somebody who wore my nails at this time, because I'm sure at least 3 people on this call want to get time with him, gave me a piece of advice. He said, when people start booking your calendar on Monday and Tuesday, start blocking your calendar on Friday and Thursday. So he would practice what he called defensive calendar blocking. So if people would start to book him on Monday, he would start to book on Friday until like time was gone, because like we're in the office, for a long period of time. And if you look at my calendar, like I'm looking at Scott Addy right now, just trying to get time with Scott Addy, or Scott Addy trying to get time with me would be really difficult because people take my time. I have very firm blocks on my calendar. Manage your time. Do not play schedule chicken. You will lose every time. Make sure that you own your time. And I would also, Damien likes to talk about the metaphor of the big rocks. Figure out what your big rocks are. Do those first. I think especially PMs who used to be developers, they have that eye on the minutia, the eye on the code, the eye on the API. You want to stay kind of in the weeds. You can't do that as you escalate through the ranks as a PM, because you need to think about 50 customers doing that or 50,000 customers doing the thing you're doing versus the one thing you're looking for. So I would just say, figure out how to soften your vision, figure out how to own your calendar. And for the love of all that is holy and sacred in the universe, the most valuable thing you can learn as a PM is the shortest word of the English language: no.
Can you repeat that last bit?
No.
The most important thing?
No.
Learn to say no. Isn't that true for an engineer as well? Like the PMs come running along and say, hey, I have this idea. Can we do blank?
Mm-hmm.
They're going to say no, right?
They're going to say they're probably going to say, why should we?
Yeah. And that's the right question.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So here's another question. What needs to change for a developer to transition to PM in terms of mindset, skills, or things to learn? We touched on this already, but.
Yeah, we did. It's okay. People come in live. I'll come in late. The main thing I would say is patience. Like, PMs need to be a little more patient than devs. There's a lot of stuff we have to do that we don't understand until you do it. Mm-hmm. If I were to go to the man in the red shirt and say, you know what we need? We need open API for every web API project out of the gate. He would say, how many customers have asked for it? If you do this, probably not going to end well. If you can go, 37 customers have told us that they like the idea. 100% of customers said that they like it on F5 for to go to the Swagger UI start page. 100% of customers were able to figure out how to debug it without being told or guided. That's data. So I think a dev can't do that, because the dev is like, You're down there in the product. You know how the product is supposed to work. You know how a user is supposed to use it. A PM needs to try to see what a customer won't do right.
Right. There's a lot of like unknown, right? I feel like my transition from an engineer to PM was, and it took over a year before I was comfortable as a PM.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of it was being comfortable with uncertainty. Like, I don't know if it's that way. You then have to research. You have an idea, but you don't even know if is it interesting to anyone else but you. So now you have to kind of go out in the real world and make a case for your idea to see whether it's, can you validate it or not.
Yeah.
And that's a hard thing to do, because that process, you're now spending a lot of time on something that might be in value, that might have no value or even negative value, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so you have to accept that. That's not easy.
It's not easy. I think the hardest thing for me, and I think Mads can remember when I didn't believe in the 86%. It was 100% or die. Hunter used to always tell people, "This is Brady. He keeps his volume at 12 at all times." That was like how the man would introduce me. It was also difficult to, like, if it wasn't 100% or 110%, I would go to my car and just sit there and freak out. You know what I mean? Like, I took it so personally. One of the reasons that I, moved around was to learn the other areas of it that were making demands of me and my team. To understand, why does marketing care about this so much? Let me get to marketing. To understand, why does it take Docs so long to get this right? No offense to Docs, it was at the time, not anymore. So I went to Docs and I worked on that. Now I understand why it's hard. There's 39,000 languages they have to write those docs in. So all of those things are difficult. I think a lot of it was learning how to take it not personally. I think devs become very connected to their product and they want it to be right and they want every line of code to be right. And that they kind of take it personally. I take my code more personally than I take my PM work. Stepping away and not taking things personally is the other piece of feedback I'll give you. If you can't do that, don't become a PM yet. Wait, you'll get there.
Yeah.
Just wait.
That's a really good one, right? Be ready to kill your darlings. Don't die on the cross for an idea that proved not to be useful. It could just be the wrong time. Give it another year, see if it is better at that point, or time it or whatever. And don't get discouraged. There's a lot of. Do you remember, like, when you had your first sort of design specs? So these are PMs have design specs just as engineers do. Before you start something, you present, here's what I plan for this feature to do and how it should work. And then you have a bunch of PMs in the room, or engineering leads and managers and whatnot, and they try to shoot holes through this. And I remember the first time I went through one of these, I just started. It was like a couple of months in, and I came up with the idea of how to do the color picker in the CSS editor, the color picker that comes up inside IntelliSense, which was it didn't exist at the time. Like, the whole concept of IntelliSense not being a list of items, but being like this rich SAML control was new. And I just remember how, first of all, terrifying it was going into that and have people critique my work, but then also taking that critique. Do you have similar stories? And what happened?
I do have similar stories. I have one this morning. That's fantastic. And funny story. You debuted that feature on webcams, and I was interviewing you.
Oh,
I remember that. I remember being really
Webcams TV.
Exactly. That was pre-Corey too.
This is like 9 years ago or something.
It's like 9 years ago, Fred. So your question was more on what part of the process? I'm sorry, I got distracted by the fact that I interviewed on that.
It was the whole spec review.
Back to not taking it personally. That would be the first thing there. I had a perfect example of that happen just this morning. We have, like I talked about earlier, one of the things that I do is this and look for ads in the previous screen. I agree. I look for ways to improve kind of the .NET on Azure end-to-end experience. One of the things that we have to do is we have to report on that end-to-end experience once a month. This morning we had kind of the preview meeting for that, and we kind of got some really good feedback. And by really good feedback, I mean we got a lot of feedback. And a lot of that feedback was like, tell the story better. This message didn't land in this slide. Take this slide out completely. Don't talk about this. All of that is like, that's the kind of feedback that we get when you're doing these end-to-end reviews versus the kind of feedback that you would get if you were doing like an architecture or a code review. I could take it really personally and be like, oh no, we're dead. We didn't do well. It wasn't 100%. Oh my gosh. But I wouldn't be in that room if I took it personally getting up to that point. You know what I mean? A lot of it is learning what you can deal with and then learning how to take that feedback and do something productive with it. It's also one of these things where I kind of have this, I think you and I used to talk about this when we worked together more closely. I used to have this kind of 3-week rule. Is whatever just happened going to bug me in 3 weeks? Most of the time, no, it's not. Like, have I lived through harder things? Probably. You know what I mean? Is it important? It's still important, but I can't let it get me to the point where I'm not going to be effective. I just have to go, I wish I had gone better, and then just keep going. Like just you get a second try. I would also say a lot of PMs, there's this, here's like Gaster's rule. It's very important. Remember this rule. Software is never finished. There's no such thing as done. Okay. So when you go in and you want to show your feature off and you get feedback from people and they say, I want you to go do blah, 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 blah with it, or I don't like this, change it this way. Don't take that as bad feedback. Take that as good feedback because they care enough about the experience you just showed them being better to give you an opportunity to make it better. So when you go in and they're just like, kill the feature, totally different conversation. That's when you want to go out that night. Just relax. But, if they give you feedback and they say, come back at the end of the week with a better story, come back at the end of the week with a better story. It's an opportunity. Don't get stressed about it. Just jump on it. Just dive on it.
I love it. Software is never done.
Never done.
So are you saying that there's nothing in .NET or nothing in Visual Studio that's done?
Never finished.
Yeah. I really like that. That's a good point. We actually have examples of like decades old code that is still being maintained or that will then be changed for let's say it's an old native component that's then rewritten into SAML like 2 decades later because we need to advance it in a certain area or whatever. And there's plenty of examples of even though something is old and considered legacy or maintenance, it's not done.
Right. It's never done.
Yep.
Like so, ClickOnce is still in the product and people still use ClickOnce. You know what I mean?
I love ClickOnce still to this day. It's phenomenal.
It's phenomenal.
Isn't the
Web deploy still it's all still in there.
Isn't Google Chrome like a ClickOnce installer?
I think so.
Yeah. I don't know. Okay. So if you think back, like from the very beginning as a PM, and you were sitting there on your chair in your office, that was back when we had individual offices. This was your first time there. What went through your head? Like, what was your biggest concern at the time?
Screwing up, same as yours.
Well, how would you screw it up?
Going into a meeting with folks like Syed and Mads, okay, who are really, really, really passionate about not only their space but about their customer, can be intimidating. Like I'm never going to do as well as they did. I'm never going to do as good of a PM. All that stuff doesn't matter. I think Donna Sarkar had a really good way to describe it. I mean, for me, the most painful part was and will always be imposter syndrome. If you look around at the people we work with, it's kind of hard to not find somebody who's flat out amazing. So when you look at those people all the time and you think about the fantastic work they're doing, it's really difficult to not contrast yourself against them and to think, wow, I'm not doing a good job. But Donna put it really well. She said, I don't look at, like I wouldn't look at a Picasso and compare a Picasso to my first attempt at doing a painting. By that same token, I wouldn't look at the second painting I did after my second week as a painter and like logically contrast myself to, excellence, in the field. What I want to compare myself to is how crappy a job I did last week.
Yeah. So we got another question here for Scott. Has the job of a PM become more difficult while working remotely?
You first.
Well, I will say yes and no. I think I'm more efficient working. I can crank out more thoughts undisturbed. Mm-hmm. So I think my time in isolation, if you will, has benefited me in being able to do work that can be done in isolation, where I don't need a group of people to agree on certain things to move forward. That is the type that has significantly slowed down. And so I think I'm much less efficient on things that require consensus, meetings, water cooler talk, like go into someone's desk to have something ironed out really quickly. I find that, quick chat is not good enough. I have to talk to someone. Well, guess what? Everyone is in a meeting nowadays because everything has to be scheduled. So the idea of just walking to someone's desk and asking them a question that takes a minute to ask now will take me a day because I have to wait for a moment in their calendar. That's my experience.
I would be inclined to agree with the majority of what you said, with a couple of exceptions. I would definitely say that it's weird being a PM, being a remote PM. I think that there are PMs who have flourished, and there are PMs who, for lack of a better word, have suffered or had challenges. I was a remote worker for a number of years, and I drove a team when I was a remote worker. So for me, it was like, oh, cool, I get to hang out at home again, and I don't have to worry about that hour commute every day, and I don't have to worry about getting interrupted. I can just work. Like you, I cannot believe how many hours every day I spend in meetings. It's somewhat overwhelming, but that's also why I've been practicing defensive calendar blocking, is to try to make that time. What I do like about it is that the interruptions, they don't happen that often, and I kind of work with people to understand what my calendar means. So I'll put tentative blocks on my calendar. Like every morning, I will block any time on my calendar that isn't taken for somebody else. I'll block it for myself. And people that work closely with me know that those are the periods of times where they can kind of ping me, and we usually have impromptu conversations. But literally from 8 to 5, most days I'm talking to somebody. That makes things difficult when you have to kind of do work that doesn't involve talking to people. Luckily, a lot of the work that I do is partner work, so it does involve talking to people and figuring out what's going on. But yeah, that's been difficult. I think I've had a better stride with it than most. I have really enjoyed it. I feel like my team got bigger, and I work on the .NET team, but a lot of the work I do on the .NET team involves other partners. And if you're on the .NET team, you hang out with the .NET team. So getting to talk to partners wasn't always easy. Here, I don't have the .NET team around to hang out with. I just talk to people all day. So I've talked to Amanda and our other executives about it and said, I feel like my team got bigger, and I feel like that was a good thing, and I feel like I've been able to do more and more broadly. But I have lost sight of the immediate team stuff, and I do lament that. But and I know you lament it when I use the word lament, so I had to figure out a way to use it. So,
yep. Yeah, that's very insightful, Brady. So here's another question. That's a quick one. How long have you been a PM, Brady?
How long have you been a PM? 11?
No. I think I'm in November. I'm 10 years.
10 years?
Yeah.
So for me, it would be 8 minus the 2. Well, 8 minus 7. 7 years.
7 years. And how long were you an engineer before that?
15.
15. What was I? Like, and when I say engineer, I mean like someone that makes money off of coding.
Yeah.
I think that was 10 years. Yeah.
And I was using your stuff for like 5 of those years.
Yeah, I think you and we collaborated back in the day, like in 2006 on blockengine.net.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's how I got to know you a little bit, even though I think it was just online.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. All right. So we're coming up on the hour here. Brady, this has been really, really insightful. And here, let's say here, there's a question coming in. So if anyone has some last questions, now's the time.
I actually like this question that just came your way.
Let's see. What's it say? You said quick chat that took 1 minute or 2 requires now a meeting. Couldn't you just call someone without scheduling it first? Isn't that what the free busy indicator in MS Teams is intended for? That is an excellent question. No, I cannot, because they are already on a call with someone else. So they can't pick up, right, the phone because they're already on a call. So that's why I can't do it. It's not that people block out time, like what Brady is saying. That's not, if they had blocked out their time or they say, I'm busy right now, I would still call them. Well, I would actually chat them up and say, hey,
you got a minute.
2 minutes for a call.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's happened is people have become very efficient with Teams. There's actually pre-canned messages people have that says, don't say hello. Just ask me what you got to ask me. Like, we're here for work. Just drop it. You know what I mean?
So here's a really good question. Who can get paid more, developer or project manager?
Depends on who you're talking about.
So this is specifically to developer division. Let's just scope the question to that in Microsoft.
Okay. I would say in the developer division at Microsoft, or probably the Azure division, it is a toss-up. It isn't about what you do. I'll quote a very wise man one time who said, "You don't want to be a man of principle. You want to be a man of value. You want to figure out how much value you bring to the table." I know devs and architects who already make way more money than I will ever make at Microsoft because I don't have time to become as valuable as they are before I die or retire. You know what I mean? They're in their 20s and they're already absolutely crushing it, and everything we do depends on them.
Yeah, and as we talked about, you can be an architect, which is a very high technical role, either starting as a PM or as a developer. You can, and the same goes with distinguished engineer and technical fellow, I believe. Mm-hmm. If you're a technical fellow now we're in on Anders Heilsberg territory here. I do believe that is the equivalent of a vice president.
Yes.
And I also believe that they can choose that title if they don't want technical fellow as a title.
I think so. I think you're right.
Yeah. So no, I think there's like Microsoft is really good when it comes to that. Like,
yep.
If you're technical and that's how you want to make a career and get to the top, then you can most certainly do that. Think Scott Guthrie, right? Very technical guy, became a PM, and but he's more technical than Brady and I combined can ever hope to be.
Oh my gosh! Yeah. We get in these end-to-end meetings and people are like, they're like worried about this experience or that experience, and Guthrie will literally ask him a question about like the COGS utilization, or like. Are the machines pegged, or how's cold start, or blah 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 blah. He can go right to the wire. It's really cool to see. So,
and I think Amanda is the same. She's the same.
She absolutely is.
Yeah. She's a vice president, and she has so she knows. So you would think. Here's what I would think. I would think that a vice president that has such a broad scope, so many different products and services under their umbrella, that they have only a high level view of everything. But she has a very deep understanding of every single thing, all the way down to, but not excluding the code that was written, but all.
Oh yeah.
And it's surprising. Like, how do these people do this? Like, they're geniuses, I think.
Well, I think it's not only genius, but it's like Amanda has always worked on Visual Studio. She was a customer, and then she worked on Visual Studio, and she cares deeply for the product and all the stuff that we're doing. Mm-hmm. So it's people talk about how we're what we're doing here isn't, we're not saving babies or, whatever, but the stuff that we're doing is very, very important to us and to our community. And when you get a bunch of people who are not only that passionate about it, but that they used to be passionate customers and now they're working on the product, sky's the limit.
Yeah, right. I used to describe it as a romantic relationship, right? You were coming from, as an engineer before joining Microsoft, working in Visual Studio for a decade or two. And now you get the chance to come at Microsoft and work on Visual Studio, maybe on the same feature area that you were the user of. That's my story. I was a web developer using Visual Studio, and I came to work on the Visual Studio web team. Yep. It was like, a lack of a better term, it was like a romantic kind of transition, right?
Oh, yeah, I agree. Totally.
Yeah. Okay, so it's not just me. Good to hear.
No, it's not just you.
Yeah. And on that note, everybody, it is time for us to end this week's episode. And Brady, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for having me.
All right. And to the rest of you, see you next week for another episode. And of course, Friday, when we're going to write some extensions here right live in my garage. Hopefully, I will have painted some on the wall behind me by then. That's my hope. So you can hold me to the fire if you tune in Friday at 2 p.m.
Are you going with Visual Studio Purple?
I'm just going to prime it. I think it's going to be like sort of great whitish.
Such a great opportunity, man.
I know, but my goal for Friday is just priming, not painting, and we still don't know about the color. I did think about having like a logo where, let's see here, there.
I like that.
Like a Visual Studio logo that I can put up for when I do like these shows or whatever.
That'd be good.
Yeah. or maybe have one dangling right here. I don't know.
Yeah, we could use that old software that we used to make the big picture of Syed's face in the old office.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, everybody. Yes, Jonas, it's 2 p.m. Friday, every Friday. And this is Pacific time. Sorry about that. 2 p.m. Pacific time. That would be 5 p.m. Eastern time in the U.S., and it would be 9 p.m. Central European time.
Mm-hmm.
Is that right?
I think so. Sounds right.
All right. Until next time, then. Adios. See ya.
Take care.